Follower is a performance that's kind of like a service where you can get a real life follower for a day. So to do this, you go to this website and you sign up and you answer 2 questions. Why do you want to be followed, and why should someone follow you? And then if you're selected, you're sent a link to download an app, and when you open it, it just says waiting for a follower. And then one day, you don't know when it'll happen. You wake up and you're notified your follower is now following you, and then I'm the follower. So I have a map view, and your phone is broadcasting your GPS coordinates in real time to my map. And so I trail you down the street, try to keep you in eyesight, but use the map when I lose track. And then at the end of the day, you're notified you're no longer being followed, and you get one photo that I took of you sometime during the day. So that's the performance, and then the reasoning, or I guess the performance kind of came out of 2 different feelings. The first was more thinking about this time we're in right now, where it feels like surveillance is sort of pervasive and out of control. Like it's all around us, and we don't really have a way to understand it as a person. You're just kind of told it's this big system you need to fear. But then on the other hand, we're also in this moment of like wanting to be seen, of sharing every intimate detail of our lives on Instagram or social media, and kind of wanting people to like it and to follow you in some way. And so I felt like there was a weird kind of tension there, right? Do you want to be seen, or do you want privacy? So that was the first motivation. And then the second was much more personal, which is that I feel that I'm a very shy person, and when I first meet someone, it's the hardest part for me to figure out how to like kind of get past the small talk and actually connect with someone, or just I have a lot of anxiety that I'm going to do something wrong. And so this was almost like a hack for me, that I get to spend all day with someone and actually get quite close to them, but I don't ever have to think about what to say to them. And so then at the end of the day, I like that we part, and explicitly, like, we don't have any interaction or moment where we debrief together. Instead, both of us kind of had this, well, sometimes it's quite intense on both ends, and then you're just left with that sort of thought or experience to process a different interaction with a person. In one way, the work functions as a critique or a commentary on kind of the state of technology that we're living within right now. And I myself am pretty critical of most of it, but the point of the work is not to tell people how to feel, but instead to give them a space to decide for themselves. I feel like a lot of times, especially with the pace of kind of change and conversation online, we're expected to kind of react to things immediately, like or dislike, or you're supposed to be outraged, and there's not a lot of chance or time for nuance, or just like pulling apart something and sorting out how we feel. And a lot of times these technologies are not just black and white, and it's also not really possible to say like, no, I don't want the future to come, no thank you. So given that, it keeps coming, how do we actually find a way to understand it like on a personal level, and not just as something that's kind of imposed on us? And so I hope that out of the performances comes this feeling of some sort of agency to actually understand your role in relation to the systems around you and your own position on them. Well, it's interesting the way that people approach it. So some people are kind of just living their life like they would normally, and I follow them, and other people really take it as a moment to think about what they want to do with this day. And so I've been aware sometimes where the person is sort of leading me to different points around the city, and we're not speaking, so I don't have the context for exactly what these places mean, but it becomes clear that they're meaningful to the person in some way. Either maybe it's their favorite spots that they want to share with me, or their points that are very reflective or hold memories for them that they want to kind of revisit during the performance. And so that's always really kind of special and nice, because I'm following them and I'm starting to understand it's sort of like a story that they're telling without actually telling it or speaking it. And I start trying to piece it together in my head and imagine what this person is and what this story or this constellation of places means. And I think that actually happens with everyone that I follow. It's interesting when you pay that much attention to someone and just follow, you start making all these kinds of guesses, and you can't stop yourself from imagining this bigger picture of what they are, even though you're getting just these small instances. And then the last thing that really makes me think about intimacy with this is that I think everyone I follow, I end up, I don't know them ahead of time usually, but I end up really liking them at the end. And I'm never sure, is it just they knew they were being followed, so they kind of act like the extra nice version of themselves and always hold the door. I think it may be some of that, but I think more of it is just paying that much attention to someone. They start to become interesting, and you start to empathize with them in some way, and start to imagine that there's more to them that you want to know. So there's this interesting kind of intimacy that's there that even they don't even need to reveal that much. Your mind just starts kind of filling in all these details about what they might be like. I think the issue of control is always at the center of most of my work, and specifically kind of this ambiguity where you're not sure who is actually in control. And with each of these, I'm setting up a situation where there's me and someone else, or maybe me and more than one person, and there's sort of a tension between us where we both are sort of dependent on the other in some way. I've been thinking about this a lot with the most recent piece I'm working on, which is called Lauren, where I'm trying to become Amazon Alexa. So I go into someone's home, set up all these cameras and devices, and then take the role of Alexa by watching over them constantly and controlling the home for them. And it's interesting because on one hand, I'm sort of in control. Like it's extremely vulnerable what they're doing to let me, just watch them at every moment in their home and be in control of it. And then on the other hand, I am sort of at their beck and call. I'm watching, even when they're watching TV, I'm like on high alert, ready for whatever request, or I go to the bathroom and I kind of take my computer with me in case they need me at that moment. And so there's this question, and then back the other way, they sort of feel like maybe they need to be interesting enough for me to, justify my watching. So there's this push and pull between both sides, and I think for me that's sort of this metaphor for a lot of the social interactions or the systems that we're a part of, in everyday life, where maybe the way that power is distributed is understood in one way on paper, but then in reality it's much murkier. And then in terms of relating to, or when thinking about the audience or the way that people are involved in the pieces, I guess one thing I really like when I'm thinking about working with people in these works is this idea that I think exhibitions in museums or galleries or shows or whatever can be wonderful, but also that there's always they're prefaced with this idea that like I'm having an art experience right now, and maybe that doesn't necessarily relate to my real life. And so I really like to make work that kind of interjects or overlays on an everyday experience, so that you're sort of having this other art experience in the context of your everyday life and reflecting on it there. So I'm always trying to find ways to kind of insert things in those spaces rather than asking people to come and see a show. But it's interesting because then the idea of kind of consent comes into play. How much do people consent to this thing that they're participating in? And even in the cases where, they've signed up and they've agreed and they understand the terms, the thing that I'm proposing is not something they've experienced before. So there's always this moment where we start, the performance starts, and then they realize, and also I realize every time, just like we weren't prepared really to understand what this might feel like. On paper we thought it was an interesting idea to try, but then in reality it's kind of a surreal and really much stranger than we expected. I think it's interesting to think about cameras because they are these devices or objects where who is on either side really determines sort of the meaning of them. And so when we think about surveillance in a traditional sense, we don't really know who's on the other end. It's like vaguely the government or Google or Facebook or Amazon maybe, but we don't really know which images of us are being collected and where they're going or how they might be used. So it makes it really scary, but it also makes it hard to, I think, just conceptualize that as a human, because we're used to relating to people in a much more tangible way. So then in my work, when you know who's on the other side of the camera, it's me, or it's maybe some other person, depending on the setup of the piece. It's interesting because the reaction is suddenly people become a lot more self-conscious usually, which is funny because you think I'm just one person that has sort of motives that are clear and benevolent, and yet they feel so much more vulnerable than the idea of kind of every image of theirs, every frame going and being stored and used for whatever purpose. But I think that speaks to the fact that we understand this idea of like another human looking at us, or us looking back, and what that image means to both parties on both sides. Also, capturing an image, like the last photo that is sent with follower, or just to choose any frame from these pieces is interesting because it centers all of our focus of this whole kind of ambiguous experience that unfolds over a day or multiple days into one kind of moment and one image. And it's obvious how much is not captured in that, but also how much kind of is, and maybe hopefully makes us reconsider a little bit what it means to have so many of our images sort of collected without our knowing or completely consenting.